Hi, so today I am going to go over how to hem the bottom of your jacket and insert your bagged lining. I'm going to go over first how we get the hemming started. So on your sample, whether it's has iron-on interfacing or canvas interfacing, like my sample here. So this side has canvas, and then this side has iron-on interfacing in the front part of the jacket, and then my facing has iron-on interfacing. You are going to start out by marking your hem and then thread tracing it. So I'm just going to go over that process now. So in this sample, our hem is 1 inch, and so I'm just going to mark across 1 inch. And it doesn't matter which side you do this on. I'm doing it on the inside of my jacket. And do mark it all the way across your facing. Your next step is going to be to thread trace this. So this sample is only half of my half scale because it's my backup sample, but I'm just going to thread trace this across all the way from, I would go from one facing to the other. And the goal of this is just to be able to see it on the right side because you're about to put interfacing on this. I do not like to baste or put interfacing in my, like over my seam allowances, my vertical seam allowances. So I'm not going to baste those down because I don't want it to interfere with my putting that in later. In and out. So I just want to make sure it is where my line is, but I don't want to go through my line there because that would interfere. And this distance is good for a full-size jacket. It's a little far apart for my half scale, but it's okay. Like I said, the goal is to see it on the other side, which I'll only see little dashes on the other side because I'm only going through in little dashes, but it'll be enough. Okay. Okay, so once you have it basted across the hem, like all the way across from side to side. So on this one, I believe I did it from this side. I was just a little bit more consistent with my basting. So this will give you a more accurate hem than the spacing it further apart. Your next step is going to be to trim out the canvas from the hemline area. So you can see that if I fold this up, my canvas does not interfere with that at all. I've trimmed it just a millimeter higher than where my roll line was. And then I started applying my interfacing. So as I mentioned, I don't like to put the interfacing over my seam allowances. This just helps later if you ever want to alter the jacket hemline. So I started the process, so I didn't completely finish fusing this on, but you can see that I'm going underneath those. And so I marked it so that these pieces will just go underneath and I don't need to overlap it where I've already interfaced it. Okay, so at the iron board, I'm just going to fuse these last two pieces in place. So as always, cover your ironing board, add some moisture if your fabric allows you to do that. Some fabrics don't. And then cover again, steam and pressure for 15 seconds. So then when it's cool, you can always test it and make sure it doesn't come up. If it comes up, then repeat the process. Okay, so next up, we're going to be stitching our facing to our jacket front right across this line here at the machine. You're going to fold this back on itself like this, and you just want to make sure that you're folding it here, not on this side of that line, so on the jacket side. So you can tell because the stitch will just roll to the facing side. And also when you place this, don't line this up exactly. I find that the facing often peeks out, so I just offset it about 1/8 of an inch so it's not lined up perfectly here. My facing goes towards the hem about 1/8 of an inch, but then stitch it on the jacket stitching line. So just not visible from this side. So I'll have to remeasure and mark this across. Okay, so I just put a mark on my facing here where this basting runs into, and then on this edge I'm going to mark my 1 inch, and then I'll just draw a line straight across, and then that will become my stitching line. And I just pinned it down just to make sure it doesn't go anywhere. And I'll repeat that on the other side. So I'm going to fold it in right on that stitching line, or just past it. So it's hard to see on here, but my stitching is right here. So I'm just rolling that just to the facing side. I'm just gonna line these up so that they're matching, and then offset that facing down towards the hem, adding a pin there to make sure it doesn't move, and then pinning it here as well so it doesn't move. Then I'm going to mark where that stitching starts and measure up from this corner, that hem seam allowance, and then mark across so I know where to sew. Before you sew this, be sure to check that the two front edges of your jacket align. Okay, so at the machine, you are going to just put it in 1/2 inch from the edge of the fabric, lock stitch it in place, and then sew across to the other end, making sure you backstitch at the edge of the fabric. And then you are going to trim out your extra fabric there. So this extra fabric just creates bulk and isn't needed, so you can always check it. So hold and fold. So you just want to make sure your facing also gets in there. So I'm going to hold it there. So on the right side, if you leave that, it just ends up being a little extra bulky, so you want to take that out. And on the inside, it should just roll just ever so slightly towards your facing, because you made that facing just tiny bit smaller. Like I said, about 1/8 of an inch on a full-size garment is all it needs, and that's just so that the facing doesn't hang down, and then your roll line will also not be sloppy. So I've checked it. Now I'm going to go back and trim out this extra. So I'm going to leave about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch, and then remove this bulky stitching here. So the rest of that can stay because it does kind of come across here, and we want that. So I'm not gonna take that out. So I'm just making sure that everything's nice. If you like, you can gently push that corner out, but don't use anything sharp like a seam ripper or scissors. Don't use a pen or pencil, because then you can end up with ink or lead on your garment. Okay, on the next one, you are going to leave a 1/2 inch seam allowance here so you can fold it in. So I'm going to go the opposite direction this time. So I'm going to back stitch first, back, and then I'm going to stop a little short, right? So that I end up stop a little short, being able to end up being able to fold this edge in. Okay, and again, I'm going to trim this off. And turn it. So folding and holding is when you fold exactly where you've just sewn it. Pinch it so you have a thumb or a finger inside and a finger or a thumb outside, and you're able to pinch your finger and thumb together. Hold that and turn it. Okay. The reason why this gets bulky and ugly is because the seam allowance is all bunched up. So I can see that my seam allowance is bulging there. So I'm going to flatten that out, and then that will fix my corner. Okay. And then it should roll just a little bit to the inside, that basting that I did. So you want to just make sure that it's nice and flat. Okay, so once you have that established on that bottom edge, then if you have left this undone, it allows you to tuck it in. So I just open this up and I just roll it in so that even that little bit is rolled in, and then refold it. And it can taper out like this because you're going to be attaching that to your lining. But that just makes this a nice clean corner so that you can attach you can sew it to your hem here, and then above to your lining. Okay, so then your next step will be to iron this up, but you also want to attach these seams. So every seam, even if it's a dart, you want to attach these to the seam allowance of the jacket. So hem seam allowance to jacket seam allowance, we don't want these stitches to show through. So just like we did on those sleeves, I'm going to reach in here, and I have it folded exactly on my basting line. So I'm going to reach in here, pinch that seam allowance on one side only, and pull the jacket over so that I can sew this seam allowance together. And the higher up the cut edge you can get, the better the hold. So like that. Okay. And then just pull the hem and flip it, and it's anchored in place so that this is not coming out. Okay, and repeat that on every seam. Pinch the two together, kind of push it out. So it should look like that. And then when you pull your hems apart, it should end up being on your hem. And then you can press all of this in place and it will lay nicely. Okay, so at the ironing board, you are going to press your hem. So we've already tacked all of those bottom edges. So you just want to make sure you press it so that each one of these is pressed right on that hemline that you thread traced all the way across. Try not to ruin any of your vertical seam allowances. So I'm going to turn that across. And here on this corner, just make sure that your edge is right there. This is just going to be just a fraction up. And this lapel front should lay nice and flat. this edge, this corner should be nice. The hem should be nice. You're just rolling this all in together and then creasing it in place. A little bit of steam, then let the heat do the work. You don't need to wiggle or anything, okay? So, nice edge here, and it looks just as nice on the inside. We'll repeat that on the other side. And then we will be able to start hemming the bottom, and then that leads us to bagging our lining. So I find that sometimes a little bit of the hem just wrinkles here, just transfer that fullness in. Press and flatten everything. Just like so. Then we will be able to stitch this. So ideally you would have your interfacing go a little bit more here, but an alternative is you can put some hair canvas in here, or sometimes tailor jackets use wiggin inside between the hem and the jacket, and then that's sewn across to the seam allowances and other areas, and then you would sew to that right across, which then it doesn't show on the other side on a thin fabric like this. If you have a thicker fabric, it will not show. So I'm just going to baste across here just so I can keep that hem in place. So while I'm going to go through here first. So I'm just going to do a running stitch across here, basting this hem in place so I know that it's not going to wiggle on me while I'm doing my cross stitch. I'm not going to be sewing all the way in here, but just a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and baste a little bit in there. So I just basted that across. Now I'm going to do a cross stitch across here from left to right because I'm right-handed, maybe from right to left if you're left-handed. But I find that my cross stitches, they get a little sloppy as I go, and I get lazy and tired, so I like to just go ahead and mark where, like, centimeter marks across where I'm going to be going. It just gives me a little bit of basis to keep my stitches uniform. And again, if you were doing this as a couture coat or wanted to, you could put wiggin or another layer of interfacing in there to sew this too. Here I'm going to show you how to sew your hem with a cross stitch. To begin, fold back the facing slightly. With a wax piece of thread about the length of your arm, you are going to start by coming up through the hem between the jacket and the hem. Next, catch a couple of threads of fabric from the jacket side and then take a small stitch into the hem. The cross stitch is done by working from left to right if you are right-handed. To make them consistent and even, remember the marks I placed across the hemline 3/8 of an inch apart. At the mark, sew through the hem, then between the marks, take a tiny stitch into the jacket. At the next mark, sew through the hem, and then back into the jacket between each mark. until you get to the facing on the other side. Check the right side to ensure that the stitches are not too tight and that you are not catching too much fabric and the stitches show. Even on a thin fabric, if your stitches are a bit loose and you are only catching a few threads, you can still achieve a nearly invisible finish. If your jacket has canvas, you will only catch the canvas instead of the jacket, as the canvas should be secured well to the jacket seams. Having a few needles pre-threaded will speed things along. Secure stitches well at the beginning and at the end. Keep checking every few inches to make sure you are consistent. Finish off by sewing through your hem with a couple of loops and going through the loops to secure. Bring your needle through the fabric about a centimeter away, pull it taut, and clip. The threads should disappear. This is what it will look like on the wrong side of your garment. And this is what it will look like on the right side of your garment with minimal stitches showing, or if you have canvas or a thicker fabric, no stitches showing. This stitch does take practice and patience to get a clean, even look consistently all the way across. Once you have finished doing your hem, you can take out your basting stitches from the hem. Next, we are going to sew the lining. The lining is attached to the jacket facing along both fronts, up and around the back. It is also sewn to the jacket at the hem, as well as the sleeve hems. It is tacked several places inside the jacket, such as the armpits, the shoulders, and down the facings, darts, as well as the side seams. A bagged lining is sewn all in one step around the facing and across the hem before the hem is sewn. It is a commercial way of attaching the lining. We are going to sew the jacket the tailoring and couture way by sewing it to the facing and then to the hem and sleeve by hand. Since a bagged lining is completely sewn shut from the inside, an opening is left in a side seam or in the left underarm seam of the lining, which allows the garment to be turned right side out. The hole is then edge stitched closed. There are many areas that can be left open for turning. I have my sample here, so I have inside, I have my lining. So my lining is inside out in that the raw seams are on the outside and then my good is on the inside, but that's how it is finished. So I'm just going to tuck these sleeves into the armholes right now just to get them out of my way. And then I'm going to find my center of my lining, and I'm going to flip it up so that I can match my center facing with the center back facing with that center seam of my lining. So, and I'm just going to pin it in place. And I'll be pinning this all the way down either side, matching my shoulder seams. I'm going to take that out. So I'm matching my shoulder seams on top of each other. So I'm just peek in there and just make sure that they're on top of each other. And then this is a perfect fit, but the curvatures are opposite. So you just want to make sure that you're matching it up. A lining can have little puckers in it, it can have little tucks in it, but this should be an exact fit if you sew it with the proper seam allowance. So we shouldn't have any tucks or puckers or pulling anywhere, but it is acceptable on a lining. The lining is often slightly bigger than the garment, giving you better ease of movement all around. Here. where my facing is tucked in, I'm just going to stop so that I can deal with that later. One extra pen. I'm going to sew it to where it at least folds, and then the rest of that I'll turn in. So I've done my one side, now I'm going to go up and down my other side. So I like to go from the center back down, that way I just know that I've done it evenly and I don't have any gapes. Matching again that shoulder seam on top of the shoulder seam at your stitching line. And because my lining is just a little bit bigger, I'm going to sew this lining side down, allowing my feed dogs to ease in, aligning to my facing. At the bottom, I'm just going to show you how it will look. So I'm just going to just repin it here and take out a few pins so that you can see how the bottom will be finished. So you're going to sew it to just about 1/2 inch from the bottom hem edge, and then tuck in the lining like this, and then everything will be smooth and nicely sewn all the way down the facing and the lining with a little bit, just that 1/2 inch there. This little bit will be tucked in and everything will be clean and finished nicely. At the machine, you are going to place it into the machine so that you will be sewing it a 1/2 inch from this bottom edge. Lock stitch it in place and then sew across. As lining is very slippery, stop with the needle down when repositioning the fabric. It may be necessary to sew over the pins to keep everything aligned. When you reach a seam, ensure the seams are open or folded where they need to be on both layers. Don't be afraid to stop and transfer the fullness out of the way as you sew so you don't create unnecessary ripples and puckers. Sewing without puckers does take a bit of trial and error, especially when two opposite curves are at an exact fit at the stitching line. When you pin it together, it will look like there is going to be puckers or gathers when it is sewn. But if you can keep the raw edges together, looking and feeling for those areas that are starting to gather, and transferring the fullness before sewing over it, you will get smooth seams without any puckers or gathers when turned. Stop 1/2 inch from the hem on the other side, making sure to backstitch. Look for any areas that have puckered and fix them before turning. If you were doing this as a bag lining, you would turn and stitch the hems together completely, enclosing the jacket and lining. Turn the jacket right side out, trim off any threads, and check for additional areas that may need to be resewn. Sleeve hems can also be sewn inside out. Care must be taken not to twist the sleeves, and measuring sleeve lining length must be done to ensure that the lining is not too long or too short. It may take several turns flipping the jacket inside out and back to get the right fit. Once you have sewn your lining, gently press your lining and facing sleeve allowance towards your lining. So it's a little bit easier, I find, to do this from the right side, but you can do this while it's still inside out if needed on certain areas. Try not to put your iron completely down and only use the tip of your iron, otherwise you will wrinkle the collar unnecessarily. You can also use a hand to help elevate the jacket so that you can get that area a little bit better since it is a curve. Be careful if you have fabric that is sensitive to the iron, use a press cloth when necessary. Find that the lining doesn't need nearly as much time as other fabrics because it's usually a polyester and very accepting of heat to create a nice crease. Once your facing and lining seam allowances are pressed, this is what your lining and facing should look like. In the next video, I will show you how to sew the lining of the sleeve hem, tack the insides, and sew the jacket hem.